Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank everyone who's here on a rainy day in Washington. But I want to make 3 points in my 12 or so minutes here. The first is on numbers, the second is on unintended consequences, and the third is on a few myths. The first on numbers. You all know that the U.S. basically had 3 major migration policies, pretty much facilitate or have an open door until the 1880s, then qualitative restrictions, and then quantitative restrictions since the 1920s. And of course, we layered one on top of the other, and so that makes our immigration policy very, very complex. We've recorded a little over 80 million immigrants since 1820 when we started recording them, and 60 million came since 1965. So 3 out of 4 immigrants that we've recorded have actually come in the last 50 years. And keep in mind, as I think the other, as you already know, we are the country of immigration. We have 5% of the world's people and 20% of the world's international migrants, as the UN counts these things. So we are the major destination. What makes the U.S. unique on a global scale is the number of unauthorized foreigners in the U.S., say roughly 11 million, is equal to the total number of international migrants in the second leading country, which is Russia. So Russia has about 11.5 million residents who were born in another country. The U.S. has a little over 11 million unauthorized foreigners. So the United States stands apart in the numbers. No other country has as many international migrants. No other country has as many unauthorized foreigners as does the United States. The second point is that it's really hard to predict the outcome of legislation that affects people, whether it's tax laws or immigration laws. In fact, we used to sometimes say the one way to predict what will happen with an immigration law is read the purpose of the law and assume the opposite, and you will be close to getting it right. I mean, think of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. If you read the purpose, at that time, we thought we had 3 to 5 million unauthorized foreigners in the United States. That's roughly what the Select Commission estimated the population was. And we legalized 2.7 million under IRCA. And lo and behold, several decades later, we have roughly 11 million unauthorized foreigners. So if you were to read the purpose, which says the purpose of this law is to give a status to people who've developed roots or in the equity stake in the United States and reduce future unauthorized migration, the second part of that at least didn't work. Now, you've already heard that in 1965, the idea was to get rid of a national origin preference and substitute for it first an economic preference and a family preference is what it came out to be, but not change the composition. And of course, that was wrong. In the 1950s, 90% of the immigrants came from Europe, and by the 1980s, it was 10%. So clearly, going from 90% European to 10% European was not what people expected to happen. One of the things that was interesting, and this is where both Jerry and Peggy have done a lot of work, is the original idea was to, when we switched away from national origins quotas, was to have economic preferences. A point more, I mean, they didn't call it a point system, but you would have been selecting on the basis of foreigners' ability to contribute to the U.S. economy. And as far as I can tell, no one ever got to the point system per se. But Canada looked at that, and in I think it was 71, a few years later, that's in fact what they adopted. And so in Canada, over half of all immigrants, and remember, Canada has we take, let's say, a little over 1 million legal immigrants a year. Canada's about 275,000, and over half of the immigrants to Canada have a member who passes the points test. That is, who they're coming in because of the system which is designed to maximize the benefits of the newcomers to the Canadian economy. So the average immigrant in Canada has more education than the average native-born Canadian. We considered that, and for the reasons that you've heard, we elected to go with a family unification. And then the other thing that probably I think is worth keeping in mind, I think the United States has the most expansive definition of family in any immigration law I'm familiar with. If you look at Germany, you don't get to bring your parents in as an immigrant. In fact, you can't bring in children under the age, it used to be 18, it was reduced to 16. The theory is if you arrive as a 17-year-old and you're going to work in Germany, that means your education could have been in a different language, and that will make it more difficult to integrate into the labor force. So there is an age cutoff. Ours happens to be 21, but many other countries say if you're looking for that economic contribution, we're going to actually have a definition of family which keeps that in mind. We also do the adult brothers and sisters and all that sort of thing that other countries don't do. So the second thing is we weren't good at anticipating what actually happened, and I think everybody knows that we should keep that in mind when we consider new immigration reform legislation, given that history. The third is some of the myths that have accompanied actually two things when it comes to primarily Mexico-U.S. migration. In 1964, the Bracero Program ended. In 1965, the amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act were passed, and many people say that the combination of ending the Bracero Program and enacting the 1965 amendments, which treated all countries equally, set the stage for illegal or unauthorized Mexico-U.S. migration. And there's a certain surface logic to that, but it really, I wasn't there. It really doesn't, for the people who were there, that's not the way they sort of look at it. So let me just remind you a couple of things about the Bracero Program first, and then a few things about the Immigration Act. Remember, the Bracero Program was a program from 1942 to 1964. And what it did was admit Mexicans to work temporarily in U.S. agriculture and for some years on U.S. railroads. Over the course of those 22 years, about 4.5 million braceros were admitted. So that was admissions. The same person could have been admitted several times. In general, that didn't happen. The minimum contract was for 6 weeks, and in general, because of transport costs, they came once, stayed 6 or 8 or 10 months, and went back. Over the course of those 22 years, there were actually more apprehensions of Mexicans than were admitted legally. There were 5.3 million apprehensions. There were 4.5 million legal admissions. So it's not correct to say that admitting braceros legally ended illegal migration. There was illegal migration along with the Bracero Program. In the early 1960s, the Bracero Program was shrinking rapidly. It peaked in the mid-1950s. It was shrinking as a result of actually the Eisenhower administration beginning to enforce the laws. And the number of Mexicans admitted as braceros dropped actually to well under 200,000 a year by the end of the program. The number of Mexicans being apprehended each year was less than 100,000. So the number legally coming in was going down, the number who were apprehended was going down. And there is a certain grain of truth that there's nothing more permanent than temporary workers, because the admission of braceros over those years had put structural things in place. But the Bracero Program is something of an exception in the sense that when it ended, Mexican migration was reasonably low. And that had real impacts on the industry most affected, which was agriculture, because that's where most braceros worked. And if you'll remember, in 1965, not only were the amendments to the Immigration Act passed, but that was also the year of the grape strike in California. And In 1966, Cesar Chavez got a 40% one-year wage increase for California farm workers. 40%. That was a pretty big increase back then. That's a pretty big increase now. And that set in motion sort of roughly 10 years of what is often called the golden era for California farm workers. What was it? It was an era of one of the few times in U.S. history where average hourly earnings in agriculture rose faster than they did in the non-farm sector, in part because there weren't braceros available and there weren't a lot of unauthorized workers. It was a time of widespread mechanization. It was a time in which the U.S. government commissioned studies that said by 1975 there will be a completely mechanized U.S. agriculture, and there was a lot of thinking about what are we going to do with the U.S. workers who will soon be out of a job because rising wages are leading to mechanization. But there were a whole series of policy choices, and so let me just close by saying nothing is ever inevitable. If you look then at why did we have, so the most labor-intensive commodity in North America today is picking strawberries. In the early 1960s, they were picked primarily by braceros. They were about 10,000 acres. You need about 2 workers per acre. And the acreage it did actually shrink after the end of the Bracero program. Today we have about 50,000 acres, so 5 times more. We haven't mechanized a great deal, and that is probably the single most important labor-intensive commodity. But what happened in the mid-60s were a series of things, most of which had nothing to do with necessarily with migration, but we made a series of policy choices that did, I mean, the reality is we did have an enormous amount of unauthorized Mexico-U.S. migration. It did have its roots in agriculture, so that part is all right, all correct. But the reasons for that turned out to be a series of policy choices. So what was the story in the mid-60s? The story was that wages in agriculture were rising very fast. There was a big surge in mechanization, but there were also some other things going on, including we had an interstate highway system which allowed fruits and vegetables produced in California to get to New York City within 72 hours and look better than the stuff that came from New Jersey, which was very close by. And so we had an interstate highway system, as far as I know, that was not intended to create a demand for immigrant workers in California agriculture, since it had something to do with defense and the tanks, but nonetheless, it had the effect of creating that demand. We had some water projects in California, which moved water from the north to the south and therefore opened up a whole lot of new land. And then, of course, we made a policy decision not really to enforce migration laws. So from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, we had relatively low migration from Mexico and relatively high wages. We had some union activity. There were a lot of strikes. And then there were some peso devaluations in the mid-1970s, and that's when the upsurge really began to take off. The combination of strikes, which were typically broken by labor contractors who were hiring unauthorized workers, and the fact that we weren't doing any enforcement is what combined to what, it wasn't as if it all took off at once, but I think we first hit 1 million apprehensions in 1976. So I guess the main message is that most of the immigrants who have been recorded arriving in the U.S. have come since the 1965 Act was passed. The second is the unintended consequences, as usual, are more important than the intended. And the third is that at least when you hear this sort of seamless web between legal braceros to unauthorized, I don't think that's really the way the history actually happened. From what people who were there tell me, there was roughly a 10-year gap. It didn't. Eventually, what happened is what you read about, that today half of all farm workers are unauthorized Mexicans. But it was a series of things that came together and policy choices that were made that wound up producing that reality, as opposed to something that just seamlessly switched from one channel to another channel at the same time. Let me stop there and thank you.